Welcome to Royal Haunts and Part 2 of the House of Stuart and the Commonwealth. On the death of his father, Charles came to the throne, though James last year saw the onset of senile dementia, and it was Charles and George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, who literally ran the country, and along with the throne, Charles inherited the distrust of Parliament. He was 3 years old at the succession of his father to the English crown, but was not heir apparent until his brother Henry, the Prince of Wales, died in 1612. Up till then, Charles had lived in his brother's shadow. Being a sickly child, he didn't move to England for over a year, following his family when it was felt his health could hold up to the long journey. Even as an adult, he didn't grow very tall, and at 5 foot 4 inches is noted as being the shortest ruling king. When negotiations for a Spanish match fell through, Charles married the sister of King Louis XIII of France, Henrietta Maria, 2 months into his reign. What left a bitter taste for most was that she was a Catholic, and so was denied a coronation. The marriage at first was not a happy one, as Charles spent time with favourites, especially the Duke of Buckingham, whose influence over the king brought jealous rivals. It's been said that King James and Buckingham had a long-lasting affair, and to retain his influential position continued in the same vein with Charles up to his murder in 1628. Buckingham's death left Charles devastated, but he found solace in his wife, and soon children came, with 3 sons and 3 daughters surviving into adulthood. There were many omens that foretold Charles' reign would not go well. Most of Charles' problems with Parliament came from the religious divides. It was thought Charles had leanings towards Catholicism, while a House of Commons was made up of the staunch Puritan sect, and Scotland wished to remain Presbyterian. But Charles' thoughts were more on going to war against Spain, and that needed money. On the other hand, Parliament wanted to rule the king, and when Charles realised he couldn't rely on its members, he dismissed it, and ruling without, he seemed to manage it well for 11 years. This time of personal rule forced him to make peace with Spain, but his reforms in Scotland caused rebellion. Going with his advisers, Charles recalled Parliament, where sitting for the first time was Oliver Cromwell, but the members were not grateful that Charles had brought them back, instead making demands that after 1 month he once again dismissed them. With defeat over Scotland, Charles relinquished, giving Scottish Parliament more power and a freedom of religion. In November 1640 he once again summoned the MPs to Westminster, and it was during the first sitting that a statue of the king at Wolverton, the home of Thomas Trenchard, dropped the sceptre it was holding. Known as the Long Parliament, this proved to be just as difficult. The king's advisers were charged with treason, and Charles could do little to save them, as they were found guilty and sentenced to death. The statue at Woodhall wasn't the only one said to have been a sign of forthcoming trouble. When a bust of the king was being delivered to London, a bird flying overhead dropped blood on the figure, leaving a stain that could not be removed. It came to a head when Parliament planned to impeach the Queen. Charles entered the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest the ringleaders of this anti-royal party, but unfortunately they managed to escape. This brought a permanent rift between King and Commons, and with it being no longer safe to stay in London, Charles moved to Hampton Court while the Queen went abroad seeking funds for the inevitable civil war. No matter what the Queen did, she would be criticised for supporting her husband, and in turning to her family for help, she was also turning to the Pope. Another bad omen was foreseen when the royal standard was raised at Nottingham, only for it to be blown down. The civil war, in effect, began on October the 25th, 1642, when parliamentary troops met the royal army at Edge Hill in Warwickshire. The battle was inconclusive, with neither gaining any ground. It was 2 months later, on Christmas Eve, that shepherds tending their flocks heard the sound of fighting, and there, replaying in the skies above, was the battle itself. As news spread, people came to witness the phenomena as it played for the next several nights, and when Charles heard of this, he sent 6 officers to investigate. These men also witnessed the replaying of the battle in which they had been part, recognising fellow comrades and weeping at those who had lost their lives that day. This was an evident reenactment rather than a haunting, and something which has been reported at several other battle sites throughout history. Even today people take to going on vigils at Edgehill in an attempt to capture audio phenomena and taking photographs which often produce orbs. The final defeat for the Royalists came at the Battle of Naseby in June 1645, and disguised as a servant the king travelled to Nottingham to negotiate a deal with the Scots. Staying at the Saracen's Head in Southwell, he is said to still haunt the inn. Handing himself over to the Scots, he played for time in the hope that the English MPs would argue among themselves, and so causing it to crumble. The Scots finally handed Charles over to England, seeking a deal to be paid for their services to the parliamentary cause during the Civil War. But Charles' journey was not as a prisoner, but more like a beloved king, as people lined the streets to cheer him on. Stopping en route, he also administered the king's touch. This was known as a cure for what was called the King's Evil, being first introduced by Edward the Confessor, and during the Stuart reign was used by Charles I and his son more than any other of the monarchs. Seeing his popularity among the masses gave Charles hope. His subjects were tired of war and high taxes. The army, put together by Parliament, was also ready to rebel, as plans were made to deplete troops who had gone unpaid. Charles undertook a secret deal with Scottish nobles who raised arms for the king, and with it looking like the Civil War was going to reignite, Cromwell headed north, where after 4 days he crushed the unseasoned Scottish army. With this last hope gone, Charles had the chance to flee. Prince Charles, his son and heir, had already made it safely to Jersey, and the Queen was in France, where Charles could have joined her in exile, giving him a chance to rally an army and return. But instead he approached the governor of the Isle of Wight. Whether he was deliberately misinformed that Robert Hammond was sympathetic to his cause or not, Charles soon found himself under arrest and held under guard at Carisbrooke Castle, where he is now said to haunt. Other haunts of the king are Windsor Castle, where he is often seen in the library. Being held at Chennis Manor House for some time, the heavy footfalls heard are associated with him. And being placed at Hurst Castle, this was less inviting. The king was allowed servants and cooks, and the locals would often go and watch him dine. Being put on trial for his crimes, mainly during his personal rule without Parliament, Charles didn't recognise the House of Commons as being a court of justice. It was a Parliament made up of those opposed to the king, as Henry Ireton, the son-in-law of Oliver Cromwell, orchestrated the arrest of 140 members, leaving only 60 to condemn the king. Being sentenced to death on the 27th of January 1649, 3 days later Charles went with dignity to a public beheading. For such titled, though a king had never been put to death before, such an execution would usually be carried out within the walls of the Tower of London, while others would see their end on Castle Hill. But for Charles a scaffold was built outside Whitehall. The crowd was very passive, knowing they were witnessing something that had never happened before or since. Charles was interred at Windsor Castle, leaving Oliver Cromwell to set about turning England, along with Ireland and Scotland, into a more Puritan country.